Every stressful moment you experience after 60 may be revealing signs you never even imagined. During a consultation that deeply impacted me, a 70-year-old woman came to me because her family was concerned about behavior they considered strange. She had begun checking the locks of her house repeatedly, organizing her medications in very specific ways, and developing small rituals that had never existed in her routine. What I discovered that day completely changed my understanding of how anxiety manifests in people with more life experience. Anxiety after 60 doesn't surface like it does in movies or as we learn from books. It disguises itself, camouflaged in habits that seem like mere eccentricities of aging, but are actually our brain's desperate attempts to find control in a world that seems increasingly unpredictable. This woman, whom I'll call Donna Carmen, had developed 12 very specific behaviors that her family considered mere quirks. During our conversation, she confided in me that she felt an almost physical urge to perform certain actions, even though she knew they made no logical sense. What's most striking is that each of these behaviors had a clear neurological function, an attempt by the nervous system to regulate anxiety in ways that even she couldn't consciously understand. Neuroscience shows us that the mature brain develops unique coping strategies, different from those we used when we were younger. These strategies may seem strange to outsiders, but they make perfect sense when we understand the internal logic of the anxious nervous system. If you recognize yourself in behaviors you consider strange, or that others comment about you, write yes in the comments. Your experience can help many others going through the same situation. The moment Donna Carmen came to me was during a family crisis. Her son had found her at 3 a.m. reorganizing the entire pantry for the 5th time that week, sorting products by color and expiration dates in an almost obsessive manner. The family thought it might be the beginning of dementia, but she knew her mind was clear. What tormented her was a constant feeling that something terrible would happen if she didn't keep everything in perfect order. During our conversation, I discovered that these behaviors had begun shortly after her husband's death 2 years earlier. What seemed like just a quirky way of coping with grief was actually a sophisticated manifestation of anxiety that her brain had developed as a protective mechanism. Every ritual, every checking, every compulsive organization was an attempt to create security in a world that had suddenly become unpredictable. The most touching thing about Donna Carmen's story was when she told me she felt ashamed of these behaviors, thinking she was losing her mind. She had stopped receiving visitors because she couldn't relax when people messed with her organizations. She had isolated herself from her family precisely when she needed support most, creating a vicious cycle where anxiety fueled isolation and isolation intensified anxiety. Observing cases like hers over the years, I began to identify fascinating patterns. The mature brain develops coping strategies that may seem irrational, but which follow precise neurological logic. Anxiety in people over 60 rarely presents as overt panic attacks. It hides in behaviors that seem merely eccentric, but which are actually clear signs of a nervous system seeking balance. Donna Carmen's transformation began the moment she realized she wasn't going crazy, just responding in a very human way to challenging circumstances. The first habit I identified in Donna Carmen was repetitive security checking. Every night she had to check locks, windows, and the stove at least 3 times before going to bed. What began as a normal precaution had become an obligatory ritual. Neuroscience explains this behavior through the concept of verification loops, where the anxious brain questions its own memory, creating a compulsive need to confirm information that has already been processed. The second behavior was related to the extreme organization of medications and personal items. Donna Carmen had developed complex classification systems that constantly changed. One day, she organized by color, the next by size, then by frequency of use. This pattern reveals how the anxious brain seeks control through physical order, trying to create predictability in an environment that feels internally chaotic. The third habit involved cleaning rituals that went far beyond normal hygiene. she had created specific routines for cleaning surfaces that were already clean, always following a precise sequence that could not be interrupted. When someone interfered with this sequence, she had to start over from the beginning. This behavior represents the nervous system's attempt to create feelings of completion and completeness that anxiety constantly sabotages. The fourth behavior I observed was the selective hoarding of specific items. Donna Carmen had begun hoarding newspapers, packaging, and other objects she would normally discard, but always from very specific categories. It wasn't generalized hoarding, but a targeted collection that followed criteria only she understood. This pattern arises when the anxious brain interprets discarding as a loss of control, creating a need to preserve elements that represent stability. The most surprising discovery was realizing that each of these behaviors followed specific schedules and situations. Donna Carmen had unconsciously created a mental calendar of rituals that were activated according to different emotional triggers throughout the day. This temporal organization reveals how the mature brain attempts to create structure and predictability using available cognitive resources, even when anxiety is interfering with habitual decision-making processes. The fifth habit I identified was the need to repeatedly confirm information through phone calls. Donna Carmen called her children several times a day to confirm schedules, appointments, or simply to check on their well-being, even when she had already received this information. The anxious brain develops a distrust of its own memory, especially in situations of prolonged stress, leading to the need for constant external validation for information that has already been internally processed. The sixth behavior involved sudden changes in sleep patterns, not just insomnia, but specific rituals for falling asleep. She had to check that all electronic devices were turned off, that the curtains were closed in a specific way, and that her pillows were positioned exactly as she had determined. Any change in this sequence resulted in hours of wakefulness. This pattern arises because the anxious brain interprets changes in routine as potential threats, maintaining a state of alert even when the body needs rest. The seventh habit was related to avoiding social situations that were previously pleasurable. Donna Carmen had stopped attending church, visiting friends, and even shopping alone, but always with excuses that seemed reasonable. Anxiety in mature people often manifests itself through gradual avoidance, where situations that were previously comfortable begin to generate discomfort, leading to a progressive narrowing of the social world. The eighth behavior involved creating detailed lists for simple activities that were previously automatic. She made lists for grocery shopping, cleaning the house, even picking out clothes. These lists were not only organizational, but became mandatory for her to start any activity. The anxious brain loses confidence in its ability to remember and perform tasks, creating a dependence on external support for functions that were previously intuitive. During this phase, I discovered that these behaviors weren't isolated, but formed a complex network of mutually reinforcing strategies. Each completed ritual provided temporary relief, but also reinforced the belief that without these behaviors, something negative could happen, creating a cycle that perpetuates and expands over time. The ninth habit I observed was the need to always have a detailed plan for any possible unforeseen event. Donna Carmen had developed elaborate mental scenarios for situations that would likely never occur, spending hours a day planning responses to imaginary emergencies. This behavior reveals how the anxious brain tries to create a sense of control over the unpredictable, devoting enormous cognitive resources to preparing for events that exist only as possibilities. The 10th behavior was related to the exaggerated interpretation of normal physical signals. Any headache became a concern for stroke. Any forgetfulness became a fear of dementia. Any palpitations generated panic about heart problems. Anxiety in older adults often manifests itself through the amplification of normal bodily sensations, where the brain interprets habitual signals as significant threats, creating self-reinforcing cycles of worry. The 11th habit involved the need to always have all possible information before making any decision, even the simplest. Choosing a restaurant became an hours-long research process. Buying a product required exhaustive analysis of reviews and comparisons. This pattern arises when the anxious brain interprets decisions as potential risks, demanding absolute certainty in a world where certainty rarely exists. The 12th and final habit I identified was the tendency to anticipate problems in neutral situations. Donna Carmen interpreted silences as signs of irritation, changes in tone as indicators of conflict, delays as evidence of disaster. The anxious brain develops social hypervigilance, interpreting ambiguities as threats and creating tension in relationships that could be sources of support. What strikes me most about these cases is how each behavior makes perfect sense when we understand the inner logic of anxiety. They're not signs of weakness or loss of ability, but sophisticated strategies the brain develops to deal with prolonged stress. Transformation happens when we understand that these habits are symptoms, not permanent personality traits. If you recognize some of these patterns in your own experience, know that you're not alone and that there are ways to regain a sense of tranquility. Subscribe to the channel to receive more content on how the mature brain can find balance even in challenging times. The moment of greatest transformation for Donna Carmen came when she realized that her behaviors were not personal failings, but adaptive responses of a nervous system trying to protect her. During a consultation, I explained how the mature brain possesses enough neuroplasticity to develop new patterns, but also retains very vivid emotional memories that can be activated by stressful situations. We discovered that many of these strange habits were rooted in past experiences she had almost consciously forgotten, but which remained active in her nervous system. Her husband's death had reactivated old fears of abandonment and insecurity dating back to childhood, when she had lost her father at a young age. Her brain had created these rituals as a way to avoid reliving that feeling of helplessness. The breakthrough came when she realized she could maintain some organizational behaviors that truly helped her, while gradually relaxing those that were limiting her life. It wasn't necessary to eliminate everything at once, but to identify which habits served her and which were serving her anxiety. This distinction is crucial for mature people who have enough wisdom to negotiate their own mental patterns. If this information resonates with you or someone you know, please share it. Many people are going through similar situations without understanding that there is an explanation and, more importantly, that there is hope for improvement even after age 60. A fascinating discovery I've made working with people like Donna Carmen is that anxiety in later life often carries hidden wisdom. These strange behaviors often represent sophisticated attempts at self-care that the brain has developed based on decades of life experience. The challenge lies in separating wisdom from unnecessary suffering. I've observed that people who develop these peculiar habits often have heightened sensitivity to changes in the environment and the people around them. This hypervigilance, which can be exhausting when unchecked, can also be channeled into valuable insights into situations and relationships. The difference lies in learning when to trust these perceptions and when to recognize that anxiety is distorting reality. Donna Carmen's journey taught me that each person develops their own language of anxiety. The 12 habits she presented were unique, as were the solutions we found together. There is no universal formula, but there are principles that can be adapted to each individual situation. The most important thing is to validate that these behaviors make sense within the person's internal logic, even when they seem irrational to outside observers. Another crucial thing I learned is that well-meaning family members often try to convince the person that their fears are unfounded, but this rarely works. Anxiety doesn't respond to logic the way other problems do. It needs to be understood, respected, and then gradually transformed through experiences that prove that safety can exist without extreme rituals. What moves me most about these cases is realizing how mature people often feel ashamed for developing these behaviors. as if they were signs of weakness or mental deterioration. In reality, they are evidence of a brain that remains active, creative, and adaptive, trying to find solutions to complex emotional challenges using all available resources. Neuroplasticity has no age limit. Even after 70, 80, or 90, the brain maintains the capacity to form new connections and develop more functional patterns. The key is to work with accumulated wisdom, not against it, recognizing that each person has unique internal resources to find their own path back to balance. If you've had similar experiences or know someone who exhibits some of these behaviors, share your perspective in the comments. Your observations may offer valuable insights to others navigating similar situations. Donna Carmen's story continues to be a source of inspiration for me and many others who discovered that her strange behaviors weren't signs of decline, but evidence of a brain that never stopped trying to protect them. Today, 2 years after our first meeting, she maintains some of the organizations that truly benefit her, but without the compulsion that once dominated her routine. She learned to distinguish between genuine care and disguised anxiety, maintaining the wisdom she had developed throughout her life while relaxing the behaviors that were limiting her freedom. She began receiving visitors again, resuming social activities, and, most importantly, regained confidence in her own ability to navigate life with serenity. What impresses me most is how this transformation inspired other family members to understand their own anxiety patterns. Often, behaviors we consider normal in ourselves are early signs of the same mechanisms that manifest more clearly in mature people. Anxiety is a universal language that expresses itself differently at each stage of life. If you've recognized some of these patterns in yourself, remember that recognition is the first step toward transformation. If you know someone who exhibits similar behaviors, offer understanding before trying to offer solutions. Validation is often more powerful than any well-intentioned advice. Subscribe to the channel to see more content about how the mature brain finds unique pathways to well-being. Leave a like if this content brought clarity to situations you were trying to understand. Share it with people who might benefit from this information. And don't forget to comment with your own observations or experiences, creating a community of support and mutual understanding. In the next video, we'll explore how to identify when these behaviors are adaptive and when they may indicate a need for professional support. Until then, remember that every day after 60 can be an opportunity to rediscover peace of mind, even when the path seems unconventional.